Picture this. You're crouched behind a row of metal lockers, your hands shaking as you watch three seniors systematically destroy everything you've worked months to build. Your art portfolios scattered across the hallway floor like broken dreams, your carefully organized textbooks torn and trampled, and your most precious possession, a handmade journal filled with stories you've never shared with anyone, dangling from the ceiling fan above your locker, pages fluttering like dying birds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The entire hallway is watching, some filming with their phones, others laughing at what they think is just another typical Tuesday at Riverside High. But what they don't know is that the quiet girl they've been tormenting for months isn't who they think she is. What they're about to discover will shock everyone in that hallway, including herself. This is the incredible true story of Sophia Chen, and how one moment of rage changed everything forever. The morning fog hung thick over Riverside High School, like a gray blanket muffling all sound and hope, creating the perfect atmosphere for someone who preferred to remain invisible. Sophia Chen pulled her oversized hoodie tighter around her small frame as she navigated the crowded parking lot, her worn canvas messenger bag clutched protectively against her chest. At 17, she had perfected the art of moving through crowds without being noticed, a skill she had developed out of necessity rather than choice. Her long black hair fell in straight curtains on either side of her face, creating a natural barrier between herself and the world that had proven time and again to be hostile territory. The weight of her messenger bag felt heavier than usual this particular morning, loaded not just with textbooks and notebooks, but with the accumulated burden of 3 years at Riverside High. Every step toward the imposing brick building felt like walking toward an execution, though Sophia had long since stopped hoping for a reprieve. She had learned to measure her days not in hours or class periods but in small victories, making it to her locker without incident, finding an empty bathroom stall during lunch, getting through English class without being called upon to read aloud. These modest achievements had become the milestones of her existence, tiny moments of safety in an environment that felt increasingly dangerous with each passing week. Riverside High School sprawled across several acres of what had once been farmland, its modern architecture attempting to project an image of progress and innovation that stood in stark contrast to the outdated social dynamics that governed its hallways. The building housed nearly 2,000 students from across the district, creating a complex ecosystem where traditional hierarchies flourished, and those who didn't fit the accepted molds often found themselves struggling to survive. For students like Sophia, who possessed neither the confidence to claim space nor the social connections to guarantee protection, navigating this environment required constant vigilance and careful planning. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical whisper, releasing a wave of artificial warmth and the familiar cocktail of teenage anxiety that seemed to permeate every surface of the building. Sophia checked her watch, 7:45, which meant she had exactly 15 minutes before first period to accomplish what should have been a simple task, but had become increasingly complicated over the past several weeks. She needed to retrieve her biology textbook from her locker, organize her materials for the day, and hopefully avoid any encounters with the group of students who had made her life their personal entertainment project. Her locker was located in the science wing, a choice she had made sophomore year when the guidance counselor had allowed students to request specific locations. Most students wanted lockers in the main hallway where they could see and be seen by their friends throughout the day, but Sophia had specifically requested a spot in the quieter academic wings where foot traffic was lighter and the chances of unwanted attention were reduced. For 2 years, this strategy had worked reasonably well, allowing her to maintain the low profile that had become essential to her emotional survival. But everything changed when Jessica Rodriguez arrived at Riverside High at the beginning of senior year. Jessica was a transfer student from California, a fact she mentioned frequently, and with the kind of casual authority that suggested her previous experiences had been far more sophisticated and worldly than anything small-town Oregon could offer. She was tall and athletic, with perfectly straightened auburn hair and a wardrobe that managed to look expensive while staying just within the boundaries of the dress code. More importantly, she possessed the kind of magnetic confidence that drew other students to her like iron filings to a magnet, quickly establishing herself as someone whose opinions mattered and whose approval was worth seeking. Under normal circumstances, Sophia and Jessica would have existed in completely separate social universes, their paths crossing only in the most superficial ways during class changes or cafeteria lines. But fate and the alphabetical logic of locker assignments had placed Jessica's locker directly adjacent to Sophia's, creating an unwanted proximity that had gradually escalated from mere inconvenience to active torment. What had started as occasional eye rolls and whispered comments had evolved into a systematic campaign of harassment that seemed to grow more creative and cruel with each passing week. Jessica had quickly identified Sophia as someone who wouldn't fight back, wouldn't report incidents to teachers, and wouldn't rally friends to her defense, primarily because she didn't have any friends to rally. This recognition had transformed Sophia from a random classmate into a valuable resource, someone Jessica could use to demonstrate her power and entertain her growing circle of admirers without risking any meaningful consequences. The fact that Sophia was clearly intelligent, hardworking, and talented in ways that Jessica was not only added an extra layer of satisfaction to the dynamic, allowing Jessica to frame her cruelty as some kind of social correction rather than simple bullying. The science wing was mercifully quiet as Sophia approached her locker, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished concrete floors. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows that provided additional cover for someone who had learned to appreciate any form of concealment. She paused at the corner where the main hallway intersected with the science corridor, listening carefully for voices or laughter that might indicate the presence of Jessica and her followers. Hearing nothing but the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional slam of a locker door, Sophia took a deep breath and made her way toward locker number 247. Her combination lock had been changed 3 times since the beginning of the school year, each replacement necessitated by mysterious malfunctions that always seemed to occur shortly after Jessica had been seen lingering near Sophia's locker. The first time, Sophia had assumed it was simply a mechanical failure, the kind of random inconvenience that occasionally disrupted student life. The second time, she had begun to suspect sabotage but couldn't prove anything, and felt too intimidated to make accusations that might escalate the situation. By the third time, she understood that this was part of a deliberate pattern, but she also recognized that reporting the incidents would likely make her life worse rather than better. The current lock was a heavy-duty model that her mother had purchased after Sophia had tearfully explained that she was having recurring problems with her school storage. Linda Chen had assumed her daughter was simply unlucky with mechanical devices and had invested in what the hardware store clerk had assured her was the most reliable lock available. Sophia hadn't bothered to correct her mother's assumptions, partly because she didn't want to worry her, and partly because she couldn't figure out how to explain the complexity of her situation without sounding paranoid or overly dramatic. This morning, the lock opened smoothly on the first try, which Sophia took as a promising sign that perhaps she might make it through the day without any major incidents. She pulled open the metal door and immediately felt her heart sink as she took in the state of her carefully organized space. Someone had been inside her locker again, despite the new lock, and despite her efforts to keep her combination secret. Her textbooks were still there, but they had been rearranged in a way that would make her morning routine more difficult. Her notebooks had been stuffed randomly into the bottom of the locker, rather than standing upright in the organized system she had developed. Most disturbingly, her art portfolio, a leather case that contained months of work for her advanced art class, was nowhere to be seen. Sophia felt a familiar combination of anger and helplessness wash over her as she surveyed the damage. The art portfolio represented more than just classroom assignments. It contained pieces that she had worked on during evenings and weekends, drawings and paintings that expressed feelings and ideas she had never been able to articulate in words. The portfolio was also essential for her college applications, as she was hoping to pursue a degree in graphic design at one of several universities that had strong programs in visual arts. Without those pieces, months of work would be lost, and her applications would be significantly weakened. She began searching through her locker more systematically, hoping that perhaps the portfolio had simply been moved, rather than stolen entirely. As she shifted books and binders, looking for any sign of the missing case, she heard footsteps approaching from the direction of the main hallway. The sound was distinctive, multiple people walking together with the kind of casual confidence that suggested they owned whatever space they occupied. Sophia's stomach clenched with anticipation as she recognized the rhythm and cadence of Jessica's group making their morning rounds. The conversation reached her before the speakers came into view, Jessica's voice carrying easily through the empty corridor as she regaled her companions with some story that seemed to require dramatic gestures and frequent bursts of laughter. Sophia considered closing her locker and trying to slip away before they reached her section of the hallway, but she still needed her biology textbook and her morning quiz materials. More importantly, running away would only postpone the inevitable confrontation and might actually make things worse by suggesting that she was afraid and easily intimidated. Instead, she forced herself to continue searching through her locker, trying to project an appearance of calm focus while her heart raced with anticipation. She had learned that showing fear or distress only encouraged Jessica's group to escalate their behavior, while maintaining a neutral expression and continuing with her tasks sometimes allowed her to avoid becoming the center of attention. It wasn't a foolproof strategy, but it had worked often enough to become her default approach to these encounters. "Well, well, well." Jessica's voice cut through the morning, quiet like a blade, carrying the particular tone of delighted discovery that Sophia had come to dread. "Look who's having trouble finding her things this morning. That's so weird, Sophia. I wonder how your stuff could have gotten all mixed up like that." Sophia didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the comment, didn't give Jessica the satisfaction of seeing her reaction. She continued methodically searching through her locker, her movements steady despite the tremor in her hands that she hoped wasn't visible from where Jessica stood. She had found her biology textbook and was now looking for her calculator, trying to maintain the fiction that this was simply a normal morning routine rather than a search for sabotaged belongings. "Maybe she's looking for something specific," suggested Chloe Martinez, Jessica's most devoted follower, and the girl who seemed to take the greatest pleasure in participating in these morning entertainment sessions. Chloe was shorter than Jessica, but made up for her lack of physical presence with an aggressive personality and a talent for escalating situations just enough to create maximum discomfort without crossing lines that might attract adult intervention. "Oh, I bet I know what she's looking for," Jessica said, her voice taking on a tone of mock helpfulness that was somehow more threatening than direct hostility. "Sophia, are you by any chance missing a big black portfolio case? Because I think I might have seen something like that around here somewhere." This time, Sophia did turn around, unable to maintain her pretense of indifference when it came to her artwork. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica stood about 10 feet away, flanked by Chloe and two other girls whose names Sophia had never bothered to learn, but whose faces had become unfortunately familiar over the past several months. Jessica's expression was a masterpiece of false innocence, her eyes wide with apparent concern while her mouth curved in the barely suppressed smile of someone who was enjoying herself immensely. "Where is it?" Sophia asked, her voice coming out quieter than she had intended but still carrying clearly in the empty hallway. She immediately regretted speaking, knowing that any response would be interpreted as engagement and would encourage Jessica to continue the game, but her concern for her artwork had overridden her usual caution. "Where is what?" Jessica replied, tilting her head slightly as if confused by the question. "I just said, I thought I might have seen something that looked like what you're looking for. I didn't say I knew exactly where it was or anything like that." The distinction was meaningless, and everyone present understood that, but it allowed Jessica to maintain plausible deniability while continuing to torment her target. This kind of verbal maneuvering had become Jessica's specialty, allowing her to inflict psychological damage while staying just within the boundaries of behavior that adults might dismiss as typical teenage drama, rather than recognizing it as systematic harassment. "I need my portfolio back," Sophia said, her voice gaining strength as her concern for her artwork overcame her fear of confrontation. "It has all my work for college applications. You can't just take someone's school materials." "Take?" Jessica's voice rose in apparent outrage, though her eyes sparkled with amusement at Sophia's distress. "Did I say anything about taking anything? I just mentioned that I might have seen something that looked like what you're looking for. But since you're being so accusatory, maybe I'm not as motivated to help you find it as I was a minute ago." Sophia felt trapped by the impossible logic of the situation. If she continued to press for information about her portfolio, she would be labeled as aggressive and unreasonable. If she backed down and accepted Jessica's non-answer, she would lose her artwork and be seen as weak and easily manipulated. Either choice would result in some form of victory for Jessica, while Sophia would be left to deal with the consequences of whatever decision she made. "Look, I don't want any trouble," Sophia said, choosing what seemed like the path of least resistance. "I just need my portfolio back so I can get to class. If you know where it is, could you please just tell me?" "I love how polite she is," Chloe said to Jessica, as if Sophia weren't standing right there listening to every word. "It's so sweet how she always says please and thank you, even when she's accusing people of stealing her stuff." "It is pretty adorable," Jessica agreed, her tone suggesting that adorable was not necessarily a positive quality in someone their age. "But I'm not sure why she thinks I would know anything about her missing portfolio. I mean, it's not like I go around keeping track of other people's belongings." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of two more students, upperclassmen that Sophia recognized but had never spoken to. Under normal circumstances, their presence might have provided some protection by creating witnesses to whatever was happening, but Jessica had proven remarkably skilled at conducting her harassment campaigns in ways that appeared innocent to casual observers. To anyone walking by, this would look like a normal group of students having a casual conversation before first period, rather than a systematic effort to psychologically torment someone who couldn't defend herself. "Hey, Jessica," one of the newcomers called out, a tall boy wearing a Letterman jacket that identified him as a member of the varsity basketball team. "Are you still coming to Marcus's party this weekend?" He said to make sure all the cool people knew they were invited. "Definitely," Jessica replied, immediately shifting her attention to the more socially valuable interaction, while keeping one eye on Sophia to ensure she didn't try to escape during the distraction. "I was actually just helping Sophia here find some missing homework or whatever. She's having trouble keeping track of her stuff." The casual dismissal stung more than Sophia had expected, reducing her missing portfolio to homework or whatever, and framing her as someone too disorganized to manage her own belongings. But it also provided her with an opportunity to disengage from the conversation and continue searching for solutions to her problem without appearing to flee from the confrontation. As the group's attention shifted to weekend social plans, Sophia turned back to her locker and tried to think strategically about her situation. Her portfolio was clearly somewhere in the building, most likely hidden in a location that Jessica could access, but that wouldn't be easily discovered by school staff or random students. The hiding spot would need to be somewhere that Jessica could retrieve the portfolio if she decided to return it, but also somewhere that would maximize Sophia's distress while she searched for it. The first period bell rang, sending a wave of urgency through the hallway as students began moving toward their respective classrooms. Sophia still hadn't found her calculator, and she now had to add "locate missing portfolio" to her growing list of problems that needed immediate attention. She grabbed her biology textbook and the notebooks she had managed to locate, closed her locker, and began walking toward her first class, her mind racing with possibilities and contingency plans. "Oh, Sophia," Jessica called out just as Sophia reached the end of the science wing, her voice carrying just enough false sweetness to make the words sound like poison. "I just remembered something that might help you find what you're looking for. Check the third-floor bathroom near the art rooms. Sometimes people leave things there by accident." The suggestion was delivered with such transparent malice that even Jessica's followers looked slightly uncomfortable, as if recognizing that this particular escalation might be crossing a line that could have serious consequences. But Jessica seemed energized rather than concerned by their reactions, feeding off the drama and attention that her increasingly bold behavior was generating. Sophia didn't respond to the suggestion, didn't acknowledge Jessica's words with so much as a glance in her direction. Instead, she continued walking toward her biology class, her jaw set with determination, and her mind already working through the implications of what Jessica had just revealed. The third-floor bathroom near the art rooms was one of the least monitored areas of the school, a location where something could be hidden or destroyed without much risk of discovery. If her portfolio was really there, it might already be damaged beyond repair. The biology classroom was buzzing with pre-quiz anxiety as students reviewed their notes and attempted last-minute cramming sessions. Sophia took her usual seat in the second row, close enough to the front to avoid social interactions, but not so close as to draw unwanted attention from the teacher. She pulled out her textbook and tried to focus on the material they would be tested on, but her mind kept wandering to her missing portfolio and the growing certainty that this situation was escalating beyond anything she had experienced before. Mrs. Patterson called the class to order and began distributing quiz papers, her efficient movements and no-nonsense attitude providing a temporary refuge from the social dynamics that dominated most of Sophia's school experience. For the next 45 minutes, she would be evaluated solely on her knowledge of cellular respiration and photosynthesis, topics that were challenging but ultimately manageable through study and preparation. The quiz represented one of the few areas of her life where effort reliably translated into success, where her intelligence and dedication could produce measurable results. As she worked through the multiple-choice questions and short-answer problems, Sophia felt some of her anxiety begin to recede. This was territory where she felt competent and confident, where her years of careful note-taking and thorough studying gave her a significant advantage over classmates who relied primarily on last-minute preparation. She knew the material well enough to work quickly but carefully, finishing the quiz with 10 minutes to spare and using the remaining time to review her answers for any careless errors. The period ended with the familiar chaos of students gathering their belongings and rushing toward their next classes, but Sophia remained seated until most of her classmates had left the room. She needed a few more minutes to steel herself for what came next: the trip to the third-floor bathroom to investigate Jessica's cryptic suggestion. Part of her hoped that the suggestion had been nothing more than psychological warfare, an attempt to send her on a wild goose chase that would waste her time and add to her frustration. But another part of her, the part that had learned to take Jessica's threats seriously, suspected that she would find exactly what she was looking for. The third floor of Riverside High was technically part of the main academic building, but it felt more like an afterthought, a collection of specialized classrooms and storage areas that had been added as the school's enrollment grew beyond the capacity of the original structure. The art rooms were located at the far end of the corridor, along with the music practice rooms and the theater department's costume storage. It was an area that most students only visited for specific classes or extracurricular activities, which made it an ideal location for activities that required privacy and minimal supervision. The bathroom Jessica had mentioned was a small, rarely used facility that served the art wing, and was known primarily for its poor lighting and persistent smell of cleaning chemicals. Sophia had used it occasionally during her art classes, but she had always found it vaguely depressing and had learned to time her bathroom breaks to coincide with trips to more pleasant facilities elsewhere in the building. Now, as she climbed the stairs toward the third floor, she felt her stomach churning with a combination of anxiety and anger at being forced into this humiliating treasure hunt. The hallway was deserted except for the distant sound of a piano being played in one of the music rooms, the melody echoing faintly through the empty corridor like a soundtrack for her growing sense of dread. Sophia's footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the polished floor as she approached the bathroom, each step bringing her closer to whatever Jessica had planned for her to discover. She paused outside the door, listening for any sounds that might indicate other people were inside, then pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the fluorescent-lit space. Her portfolio was there, just as Jessica had suggested it would be, but its location and condition made Sophia's heart sink with despair and rage. The leather case had been placed in the stall farthest from the door, balanced precariously on the toilet seat in a position that suggested it had been there for several hours. Worse, the portfolio had been opened, and its contents had been scattered across the stall floor in a way that could only have been deliberate. Months of carefully preserved artwork lay crumpled and torn among the debris, some pieces showing evidence of having been stepped on while others appeared to have been deliberately damaged with scissors or other sharp instruments. Sophia stood frozen in the doorway for several seconds, her mind struggling to process the extent of the destruction, while her body remained paralyzed by the shock of seeing her work treated with such casual cruelty. These weren't just assignments or homework exercises. They were expressions of her inner world, visual representations of thoughts and feelings she had never been able to share in any other way. Some of the pieces had taken weeks to complete, requiring hours of patient work and multiple revisions to achieve the effects she was striving for. Now they lay ruined on a bathroom floor, transformed from art into garbage by someone who couldn't even be bothered to appreciate what she was destroying. The full impact of the situation hit her like a physical blow, sending her stumbling backward against the bathroom wall as she fought to maintain her composure. This wasn't just vandalism or theft. It was a targeted attack on the most meaningful part of her life, a deliberate attempt to destroy not just her college applications, but her sense of identity and purpose. Jessica had managed to identify the one thing that Sophia cared about most, and had systematically destroyed it for no reason other than her own entertainment. But as Sophia stood there surveying the wreckage of months of work, something unexpected began to stir in her chest. Beneath the grief and despair, she felt the first flickering of an emotion she hadn't experienced in years: genuine, undiluted rage. Not the helpless frustration that had become her constant companion, not the resigned acceptance of unfair treatment that she had learned to cultivate as a survival mechanism, but clean, powerful anger at the injustice of what had been done to her. For 3 years she had absorbed Jessica's cruelty without fighting back, had accepted the role of victim, because it seemed like the safest way to navigate an environment that offered no protection for people like her. She had convinced herself that keeping her head down and avoiding confrontation was a form of wisdom, a mature recognition that some battles weren't worth fighting. But standing in that bathroom, looking at the ruins of her artwork, Sophia realized that her strategy of passive resistance had failed completely. Jessica had escalated her attacks anyway, despite Sophia's efforts to avoid giving her any excuse for retaliation. The portfolio case itself was largely undamaged, its leather exterior showing only minor scuffs that could probably be cleaned or repaired. But the destruction of its contents was thorough and systematic, suggesting that Jessica had spent considerable time and effort ensuring that as much damage as possible had been inflicted. Some pieces could potentially be salvaged with careful restoration work, but many were beyond repair, their delicate surfaces torn or stained beyond any hope of recovery. Sophia knelt on the bathroom floor and began gathering the scattered pieces, trying to assess what could be saved and what was lost forever. As she worked, her initial shock gave way to a growing sense of determination. Jessica had made a crucial miscalculation in choosing to target Sophia's artwork. Rather than breaking her spirit completely, the attack had revealed something that Sophia herself hadn't known was there. Underneath all the anxiety and fear, underneath all the careful strategies for avoiding conflict and staying invisible, there was still a core of strength that Jessica's cruelty couldn't touch. Her hands moved methodically through the debris, sorting damaged pieces into categories based on the extent of their destruction. Some drawings had only minor tears that could be repaired with careful tapework. Others had been crumpled, but could potentially be flattened and restored with patience and skill. But several pieces, including a self-portrait that had taken her nearly a month to complete, were damaged beyond any hope of salvation, their surfaces torn and stained in ways that made restoration impossible. As she worked, Sophia began to formulate a plan. For 3 years, she had allowed Jessica to control the terms of their interactions, responding to aggression with withdrawal and meeting cruelty with submission. But this latest attack had crossed a line that changed everything. Jessica had moved beyond simple bullying into deliberate sabotage of Sophia's future, and that required a different kind of response than anything Sophia had attempted before. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside made Sophia freeze, her hands full of damaged artwork as she crouched on the bathroom floor. For a moment, she felt exposed and vulnerable, caught in a position that would be difficult to explain to anyone who might walk in. But the footsteps passed by without stopping, leaving her alone with her thoughts and her growing sense of purpose. She had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible, of moving through the world without making waves or attracting attention. But invisibility was a defensive strategy, useful for avoiding conflict but ultimately ineffective at creating positive change. Jessica had proven that passive resistance was insufficient protection against someone truly determined to cause harm. If Sophia wanted to protect herself and prevent further attacks, she would need to find a different approach entirely. The bell for second period rang in the distance, reminding Sophia that she had been absent from her scheduled class for nearly 20 minutes. Under normal circumstances, this kind of tardiness would have sent her into a panic, worried about the negative attention from teachers and the potential impact on her perfect attendance record. But standing in that bathroom, surrounded by the evidence of Jessica's latest attack, Sophia found that her usual priorities were shifting in ways that surprised her. Her attendance record suddenly seemed less important than ensuring that Jessica faced consequences for her actions. Her reputation as a quiet, compliant student seemed less valuable than establishing a reputation as someone who couldn't be victimized with impunity. For the first time in years, Sophia was considering the possibility that some forms of negative attention might actually be preferable to the continued acceptance of abuse. She gathered the salvageable pieces of artwork and placed them carefully back in the portfolio case, handling each damaged drawing and painting with the reverence due to survivors of a natural disaster. The pieces that were beyond repair she left on the bathroom floor, evidence of what had been done that she hoped might prove useful later. Before leaving the bathroom, she took several photographs with her phone, documenting both the location where her portfolio had been hidden and the extent of the damage that had been inflicted. Walking back down the hallway toward the main part of the building, Sophia felt different than she had when climbing those same stairs just 20 minutes earlier. The shock and grief were still there, along with the anger that continued to burn steadily in her chest. But there was something else now, something she hadn't felt in so long that it took her a moment to identify it. It was hope, she realized, not hope that things would somehow get better on their own, but hope that she might finally have found the motivation and courage to make them better herself. The second period was already well underway when Sophia slipped into her AP English classroom, murmuring an apology to Mrs. Henderson about a bathroom emergency that had taken longer than expected. The teacher accepted the explanation with minimal comment, but Sophia could feel the curious gazes of her classmates as she took her seat and tried to blend back into the familiar rhythm of literary analysis and group discussion. But concentration proved elusive as her mind continued to process what had happened and what it might mean for her future at Riverside High. Jessica had escalated their conflict to a level that couldn't be ignored or absorbed through passive resistance. The destruction of the portfolio represented a direct attack on Sophia's academic future and personal identity, the kind of calculated cruelty that demanded a response proportional to the damage that had been inflicted. For years, Sophia had told herself that she was choosing the mature path by refusing to engage with Jessica's provocations. She had convinced herself that rising above the conflict was a form of moral victory, that maintaining her dignity in the face of abuse was somehow noble and admirable. But sitting in her English class, surrounded by the familiar routine of academic life while her destroyed artwork lay hidden in her bag, Sophia began to question whether her passive approach had really been about maturity and dignity or simply about fear. The truth was that she had been afraid. Afraid of making things worse. Afraid of drawing more attention to herself, afraid of discovering that she wasn't strong enough to fight back effectively. But Jessica's latest attack had forced her to confront an even more frightening possibility. That not fighting back might actually be more dangerous than taking a stand. By demonstrating that she was willing to accept any level of abuse without retaliation, she had essentially given Jessica permission to continue escalating until something truly irreparable was damaged. As Mrs. Henderson led the class through a discussion of character motivation in the novel they were reading, Sophia found herself thinking about the concept of transformation that appeared so frequently in literature. Characters who began as one type of person and evolved into something completely different through the pressure of circumstances and the force of their own choices. She had always been drawn to these transformation narratives, finding in them a kind of hope that change was possible even for people who felt trapped by their circumstances. Now, sitting in that classroom with her destroyed portfolio in her bag, and her mind buzzing with plans for retaliation, Sophia wondered if she might be living through her own transformation story. The quiet, invisible girl who had spent 3 years avoiding conflict might be evolving into someone entirely different, someone who fought back, someone who refused to accept injustice, someone who claimed space in the world rather than simply hoping to survive in its margins. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying, representing a fundamental shift in how she understood herself and her place in the social ecosystem of Riverside High. But as the class period continued and her anger at Jessica's cruelty continued to burn steadily in her chest, Sophia found herself increasingly committed to the idea that change was not only possible but necessary. Jessica had forced this evolution by making passive resistance an inadequate response to the level of cruelty she was willing to inflict. The bell rang, signaling the end of second period and the beginning of her brief window of free time before lunch. Instead of heading to her usual hiding spot in the library, Sophia made her way toward the main office. Her portfolio case clutched tightly in her hands, and her mind focused on the first step of what was beginning to feel like a campaign rather than simply a response to a single incident. She had spent 3 years learning how to be invisible, how to move through hostile territory without attracting the attention of predators. But Jessica's destruction of her artwork had taught her something new about herself, that there were things worth fighting for, even if fighting meant abandoning the safety of invisibility. The shy girl who had entered the school building that morning was beginning to transform into someone else entirely. Someone who understood that true strength sometimes required the willingness to be seen. The main office at Riverside High buzzed with its usual mixture of administrative efficiency and teenage crisis management, phones ringing constantly, while secretaries juggled appointment schedules and disciplinary referrals with practiced ease. Principal Davis emerged from his office carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a stack of papers that suggested his morning was already running behind schedule. He paused when he noticed Sophia standing near the reception desk, her portfolio case held against her chest like armor, and her expression carrying a gravity that seemed unusual for someone he had always categorized as one of the school's invisible students. Margaret Walsh, the head secretary who had been managing the front office since before most current students were born, looked up from her computer screen with the kind of efficient attention she reserved for situations that required immediate assessment. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between students who needed genuine help and those who were simply trying to avoid class obligations, and something in Sophia's demeanor immediately placed her in the former category. "Can I help you, dear?" Mrs. Walsh asked, her voice carrying the maternal warmth that had made her a favorite among students who found themselves in crisis situations. She had seen thousands of teenagers pass through those doors over the years, and experience had taught her to recognize the signs of someone who was carrying a burden too heavy for their shoulders. Sophia approached the counter with measured steps, her mind still processing the enormity of what she was about to set in motion. For 3 years she had solved her problems through avoidance and strategic invisibility, never once considering the possibility that the administrative machinery of the school might actually be capable of providing meaningful assistance. But standing in that office with her destroyed artwork in her hands, she realized that some situations required adult intervention whether she was comfortable with it or not. "I need to report vandalism and theft of my school materials," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the tremor of nervousness that ran through her chest. The words felt foreign in her mouth, representing a level of assertiveness that she hadn't exercised in years, but they also felt necessary in a way that overrode her usual reluctance to draw attention to herself. Mrs. Walsh's eyebrows rose slightly at this announcement, her experienced gaze taking in Sophia's careful posture and the obvious distress that she was working hard to control. Vandalism reports were unfortunately common at Riverside High, but they typically came from students whose personalities and social positions made them natural advocates for themselves. Seeing someone like Sophia, quiet, studious, and generally invisible, standing in her office making formal complaints suggested that something significant had occurred. "What kind of materials were vandalized?" Mrs. Walsh asked, reaching for an incident report form and preparing to document whatever details Sophia was willing to share. Her tone remained professionally neutral, but her body language conveyed the kind of focused attention that indicated she was taking the complaint seriously. "My art portfolio," Sophia replied, setting the leather case on the counter and opening it to reveal the damaged contents. "Someone broke into my locker, took my portfolio, and destroyed most of the artwork inside. These pieces represent months of work, and some of them are essential for my college applications." The revelation of the portfolio's contents caused an immediate shift in Mrs. Walsh's demeanor as she examined the scattered drawings and paintings that Sophia carefully arranged on the counter. Even in their damaged state, the quality and sophistication of the artwork was immediately apparent, displaying a level of technical skill and artistic vision that clearly distinguished them from typical high school art projects. The deliberate nature of the destruction was also obvious, with tears and stains positioned in ways that suggested calculated malice rather than accidental damage. "This is serious vandalism," Mrs. Walsh said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when shifting from receptionist mode into crisis management. "Do you have any idea who might have done this? Was there anyone who had access to your locker combination or who might have had a reason to target your artwork specifically?" Sophia hesitated for a moment, recognizing that naming Jessica would transform this from a general complaint about vandalism into a specific accusation against another student. Once she spoke Jessica's name in this context, there would be no taking it back, no returning to the uneasy status quo that had defined their relationship for the past several months. But looking at her destroyed artwork spread across the counter, she realized that the status quo had already been shattered beyond repair. "Jessica Rodriguez," Sophia said, the name coming out more firmly than she had expected. "She has the locker next to mine, and she's been escalating her harassment over the past few weeks. This morning she specifically directed me to the location where I found my portfolio, making it clear that she knew exactly where it was and what condition it would be in." Mrs. Walsh began taking detailed notes, her pen moving quickly across the incident report form as she documented names, dates, and the sequence of events that Sophia described. The complaint was becoming more complex with each additional detail, evolving from simple vandalism into a pattern of harassment that would require careful investigation and potentially serious disciplinary action. Has this kind of harassment happened before? Mrs. Walsh asked, her professional training guiding her toward the comprehensive documentation that would be necessary if this situation escalated to formal disciplinary proceedings. Have there been other incidents involving Jessica Rodriguez that you haven't reported? The question opened a floodgate of memories that Sophia had been trying to suppress for months. The mysterious lock malfunctions, the rearranged locker contents, the whispered comments and social isolation that Jessica had orchestrated with such careful precision. Each individual incident had seemed too minor to report, too ambiguous to prove, too embarrassing to discuss with adults who might dismiss her concerns as typical teenage drama. Yes, Sophia admitted, her voice growing stronger as she began to articulate experiences that she had never shared with anyone before. She's been sabotaging my locker combination, rearranging my materials, and conducting what I can only describe as a systematic campaign of psychological harassment. I didn't report the earlier incidents because I hoped the situation would resolve itself, but this destruction of my artwork represents a significant escalation that I can't ignore. Principal Davis emerged from his office at that moment, drawn by the unusual intensity of the conversation taking place at the reception desk. Charles Davis had been an educator for over 20 years, starting as a high school history teacher before moving into administration, and his experience had taught him to recognize situations that required immediate attention. The sight of damaged artwork spread across the reception counter, combined with Mrs. Walsh's focused note-taking, immediately signaled that this was not a routine disciplinary matter. What seems to be the problem here? Principal Davis asked, his tone conveying both authority and genuine concern as he approached the counter where Sophia stood with her destroyed portfolio. Mrs. Walsh provided a concise summary of Sophia's complaint, while Principal Davis examined the damaged artwork with the careful attention of someone who understood both its artistic merit and the malicious intent behind its destruction. The quality of the pieces was immediately apparent, even to his non-expert eye, making the deliberate nature of the vandalism seem even more cruel and wasteful. "This is Miss Chen, correct?" Principal Davis asked, consulting his mental database of student information with the efficiency that comes from years of educational administration. "You're in several advanced placement courses and have an exemplary academic record. This kind of targeted harassment against one of our top students is completely unacceptable." Sophia felt a strange mixture of validation and discomfort at being described as one of the school's top students. She had worked hard to maintain her grades and academic standing, but she had never considered herself particularly notable or deserving of special protection. The idea that her academic achievements might actually carry some weight in the administrative response to her situation was both encouraging and slightly overwhelming. "I want to ensure that we address this situation thoroughly and appropriately," Principal Davis continued, his tone taking on the formal authority that indicated he was transitioning into official disciplinary mode. "Mrs. Walsh, please prepare a comprehensive incident report, and I'll need to interview both students involved before determining the appropriate consequences." The mention of consequences sent a jolt of anxiety through Sophia's chest as she realized that her decision to report Jessica's behavior would inevitably result in a confrontation that she couldn't control or predict. For years she had avoided exactly this kind of situation, preferring to absorb minor injuries rather than risk the unpredictable fallout that might result from official intervention. But the destruction of her artwork had pushed her beyond the point where avoidance was a viable strategy. "I should mention," Sophia said, her voice careful but determined, "that I have photographs documenting where my portfolio was found and the condition of the artwork when I discovered it. I also have a history of the other incidents that have occurred over the past several months, including dates and descriptions of each episode." Principal Davis looked impressed by this level of documentation, recognizing the thoroughness that suggested Sophia had been tracking Jessica's behavior with the systematic attention of someone who understood that evidence would eventually become important. This wasn't the impulsive complaint of a student reacting emotionally to a single incident, but rather the carefully considered report of someone who had been building a case over time. "That's excellent preparation," Principal Davis said approvingly. "Would you be willing to provide those photographs and incident descriptions as part of our formal investigation? The more documentation we have, the better equipped we'll be to address this situation appropriately." Sophia nodded, feeling a sense of purpose and agency that she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since starting high school, she was actively participating in shaping her own experience rather than simply enduring whatever circumstances were imposed upon her. The transformation felt both empowering and slightly terrifying, representing a fundamental shift in how she understood her own capacity for effective action. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another student at the reception desk, a sophomore who needed assistance with a schedule change that couldn't wait until later in the day. Principal Davis glanced at his watch and realized that his next meeting was scheduled to begin in less than 10 minutes, creating a time constraint that would require careful management of competing priorities. Ms. Chen, I'm going to need to ask you to return during your lunch period so we can complete this interview without rushing through important details, Principal Davis said, his tone apologetic but firm. Mrs. Walsh will schedule a formal meeting where we can review all your documentation and determine the appropriate next steps. Sophia agreed to the lunch meeting, understanding that the administrative wheels of justice moved slowly, but feeling encouraged by the seriousness with which her complaint was being received. As she carefully repacked her damaged artwork and prepared to leave the office, she felt a strange sense of lightness, as if she had finally set down a burden that she had been carrying for far too long. The hallways of Riverside High seemed different as Sophia made her way toward her third-period chemistry class, though she couldn't immediately identify what had changed. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that she was no longer facing Jessica's harassment alone, that the adult authority structure of the school was finally aware of what had been happening and prepared to take action. Or perhaps it was the recognition that she had found the courage to advocate for herself in a way that she had never attempted before. Chemistry class provided a welcome respite from the emotional intensity of the morning, offering the familiar comfort of scientific principles and laboratory procedures that operated according to predictable rules. Mr. Thompson's methodical approach to molecular structures and chemical reactions created an environment where success depended entirely on careful observation and logical thinking, skills that Sophia had always possessed in abundance. As she worked through the day's lab experiment, measuring chemicals and recording observations with her usual precision, Sophia found her mind wandering to the meeting that awaited her during lunch period. She tried to anticipate the questions that Principal Davis might ask and the additional evidence that might be required to support her complaint. The prospect of recounting months of harassment in detail was daunting, but it also felt necessary and potentially cathartic. Her lab partner, a quiet boy named David Kim, who rarely spoke unless directly addressed, noticed her unusually distracted demeanor and offered to handle the more complex calculations while she focused on data collection. The gesture was small but meaningful, representing the kind of consideration and cooperation that existed among students who understood what it meant to feel marginalized or overlooked. "Are you okay?" David asked quietly as they waited for their chemical reaction to reach completion, his tone conveying genuine concern rather than idle curiosity. "You seem different today. Not bad, different, just, I don't know, more focused maybe?" Sophia considered how to respond to his observation, recognizing that her decision to report Jessica's harassment had indeed changed something fundamental about her demeanor and energy. She felt more present in her own life, more actively engaged with her circumstances rather than simply enduring them passively. "I'm dealing with some bullying issues," Sophia replied, choosing honesty over the vague deflections that she typically used to avoid difficult conversations. "But I'm finally doing something about it instead of just hoping it will go away on its own." David nodded with the understanding of someone who had probably faced his own challenges with social dynamics and peer harassment. "That takes courage," he said simply. "Most people just try to avoid confrontation, but sometimes that makes things worse in the long run." His words resonated with Sophia more deeply than he probably realized, articulating something that she had been struggling to understand about her own situation. Avoidance had seemed like the wise choice when she was facing minor provocations and isolated incidents. But Jessica's escalating behavior had proven that passive resistance was insufficient protection against someone truly determined to cause harm. The class period ended with their experiment successfully completed and their data properly recorded, providing Sophia with a small sense of accomplishment that helped balance the anxiety she felt about the upcoming administrative meeting. As students began packing their materials and preparing for fourth period, she realized that she was actually looking forward to lunch period for the first time in months. Rather than dreading the social navigation and potential conflicts that typically characterized her midday break, she was anticipating the opportunity to tell her story comprehensively and seek meaningful resolution to the situation that had been dominating her thoughts for so long. The shift in perspective felt significant, marking another step in her evolution from passive victim to active participant in her own defense. Fourth period American history with Mr. Rodriguez, no relation to Jessica, despite sharing a surname, provided another opportunity for academic focus and intellectual engagement. The class was currently studying the civil rights movement, examining the strategies and tactics that individuals and organizations had used to challenge systemic injustice and create social change. As Mr. Rodriguez led the class through a discussion of civil disobedience and organized resistance, Sophia found herself drawing unexpected parallels between the historical movements they were studying and her own, much smaller, but personally significant struggle against Jessica's harassment. The activists they were reading about had faced much greater risks and challenges, but they had demonstrated the same fundamental principle that was guiding Sophia's current actions: the recognition that injustice unchallenged would inevitably escalate. What motivated ordinary citizens to take extraordinary risks in pursuit of social justice? Mr. Rodriguez asked the class, his question hanging in the air as students considered the psychological and moral factors that drove people to action despite potential consequences. Sophia found her hand rising before she had consciously decided to participate in the discussion, another small indication of the transformation that was occurring in her approach to academic and social engagement. "I think it reaches a point where the cost of inaction becomes greater than the risk of taking a stand," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the classroom. "When you realize that accepting injustice isn't actually protecting you from harm, it becomes easier to choose resistance, even when the outcome is uncertain." Her response generated nods of agreement from several classmates and an approving look from Mr. Rodriguez, who seemed pleased to see one of his quieter students engaging so thoughtfully with the material. The discussion that followed was rich and nuanced, with students building on Sophia's observation to explore the various factors that motivated social action throughout history. But even as she participated in the academic discussion, part of Sophia's mind remained focused on her upcoming meeting with Principal Davis and the potential consequences of her decision to formally report Jessica's behavior. She had crossed a line that morning that she couldn't uncross, committing herself to a course of action that would inevitably reshape her experience at Riverside High one way or another. The lunch bell rang with its usual mechanical authority, sending students streaming toward the cafeteria and various social gathering spaces throughout the building. But instead of following the crowd toward food and conversation, Sophia made her way back to the main office, her portfolio case in hand, and her mind prepared for what she hoped would be a productive and decisive meeting. Mrs. Walsh greeted her with the warm efficiency that seemed to be her professional trademark, immediately guiding her toward Principal Davis's office, where a formal interview setting had been prepared. The principal's office was more welcoming than Sophia had expected, with comfortable seating arranged around a small conference table rather than the intimidating desk-based setup she had imagined. Principal Davis had prepared for the meeting with the thoroughness that characterized his approach to serious disciplinary matters, arranging his notebook and preparing to document every detail of Sophia's account. He had also requested that Ms. Jennifer Park, the school's guidance counselor, join the meeting to provide additional perspective and support during what was likely to be a difficult conversation. "Ms. Chen, thank you for coming back to complete this interview," Principal Davis began, his tone professional but warm as he gestured for her to take a seat at the conference table. "I want you to know that we take harassment and vandalism very seriously, and we're committed to ensuring that every student feels safe and supported in our school environment." Ms. Park nodded in agreement, her presence adding an additional layer of advocacy and support that Sophia hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. Jennifer Park had been a guidance counselor for over a decade, specializing in crisis intervention and student advocacy, and her reputation for genuinely caring about student welfare was well established throughout the school community. "I'd like you to start from the beginning," Principal Davis continued, his pen poised over his notebook as he prepared to document Sophia's account. "Tell us about the first incident you remember involving Jessica Rodriguez, and then walk us through the progression of events that led to this morning's discovery of your vandalized artwork." Sophia took a deep breath and began recounting the history of her interactions with Jessica, starting with the seemingly minor annoyances that had characterized the beginning of the school year and progressing through the escalating pattern of harassment that had culminated in the destruction of her portfolio. As she spoke, she was struck by how different the situation sounded when described comprehensively rather than experienced as isolated incidents. The systematic nature of Jessica's behavior became clear as Sophia detailed the various tactics that had been employed: the sabotaged lock combinations, the deliberately rearranged locker contents, the the psychological warfare designed to create anxiety and self-doubt. What had felt like random misfortunes when experienced individually revealed itself as a coordinated campaign when viewed as a complete narrative. "Can you describe the specific incident that occurred this morning?" Ms. Park asked, her tone gentle but focused as she encouraged Sophia to provide detailed documentation of the most serious offense. Sophia recounted her discovery of the missing portfolio, Jessica's pointed directions toward the third-floor bathroom, and the devastating condition in which she had found her artwork. As she described pulling her destroyed pieces from the bathroom floor, she felt the same combination of grief and rage that had initially motivated her decision to seek administrative intervention. "I have photographs documenting both the location where the portfolio was found and the extent of the damage to individual pieces," Sophia added, retrieving her phone and scrolling through the images she had taken that morning. "I also have examples of my work from previous months that show the quality and condition of the pieces before they were vandalized." Principal Davis and Ms. Park examined the photographs with careful attention, their expressions growing increasingly serious as they absorbed the evidence of deliberate destruction. The quality of Sophia's artwork was immediately apparent, making the malicious nature of its vandalism seem even more wasteful and cruel. "This represents a significant violation of our student code of conduct," Principal Davis said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that indicated he was already formulating consequences. "Vandalism of another student's property is grounds for suspension, and the targeted nature of this harassment suggests that additional disciplinary measures may be appropriate." The mention of suspension sent a jolt of satisfaction through Sophia's chest, representing the kind of meaningful consequence that she had never dared to hope for during the months when she had been absorbing Jessica's harassment in silence. But it also raised questions about potential retaliation and the ways that formal disciplinary action might reshape the social dynamics that governed her daily experience at school. "What happens next?" Sophia asked, recognizing that her role in this process was far from over, and that she might need to prepare for additional challenges as the investigation proceeded. "We'll need to interview Jessica Rodriguez and any witnesses who might have observed the incidents you've described," Principal Davis explained, his tone methodical as he outlined the administrative procedures that would guide their response. "We'll also need to examine her locker and any other areas where evidence of this harassment might be found." Ms. Park leaned forward slightly, her expression conveying the kind of focused concern that made her such an effective advocate for students in crisis. "I want you to know that we have zero tolerance for retaliation against students who report harassment," she said firmly. "If Jessica or any of her friends attempt to escalate this situation in response to your complaint, I want you to report those incidents immediately." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, as Principal Davis and Ms. Park gathered additional details about the timeline of harassment and the specific evidence that would support Sophia's complaint. They also discussed strategies for ensuring her safety and comfort during the investigation period, recognizing that the process itself might create additional stress and vulnerability. As the meeting concluded and Sophia prepared to return to her afternoon classes, she felt a profound sense of relief mixed with anticipation about what would happen next. For the first time in months, she felt like she had allies in her struggle against Jessica's harassment, adults who understood the seriousness of the situation and were committed to taking meaningful action. The remainder of her school day passed in a blur of academic routine punctuated by moments of anxiety about the investigation that was presumably beginning while she attended classes and completed assignments. She found herself glancing around hallways and classrooms, wondering if Jessica had already been called to the office, or if news of the complaint was beginning to circulate through the social networks that govern teenage communication. But there was also a sense of lightness in her step, a feeling of empowerment that came from having finally taken decisive action rather than simply enduring whatever circumstances were imposed upon her. The shy girl who had entered the building that morning was evolving into someone who understood her own capacity for effective resistance, someone who refused to accept injustice as the inevitable price of peace. Her final class of the day was Advanced Placement Art with Mrs. Martinez, a teacher who had been encouraging Sophia's artistic development since her freshman year and who had written enthusiastic recommendation letters for her college applications. The class met in the same wing where Sophia had discovered her vandalized portfolio that morning, creating an emotional resonance that made her hyper-aware of both what she had lost and what she was fighting to protect. Mrs. Martinez noticed immediately that Sophia seemed different, more present and engaged than she had been in recent weeks. When Sophia briefly explained what had happened to her portfolio and the steps she had taken to address the situation, Mrs. Martinez's response was swift and supportive. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself," Mrs. Martinez said, her voice carrying the warmth and conviction that had made her such an influential mentor to countless students over the years. "What happened to your artwork was unconscionable, but your response demonstrates exactly the kind of courage and integrity that will serve you well in college and beyond." The validation from a teacher she respected deeply meant more to Sophia than she had expected, reinforcing her growing conviction that she had made the right choice in reporting Jessica's harassment despite the uncertainty about what consequences might follow. Mrs. Martinez also offered practical support, volunteering to provide documentation of Sophia's artistic achievements and character references that might be useful if the situation escalated to more formal proceedings. As the final bell rang and students began their end-of-day exodus from the building, Sophia found herself walking toward the parking lot with a sense of anticipation rather than the usual relief at having survived another day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the investigation proceeded, and Jessica learned about the complaint that had been filed against her. But for the first time in months, Sophia felt prepared to face whatever difficulties might arise. The transformation that had begun that morning in a third-floor bathroom was continuing to evolve, reshaping not only how Sophia understood her own capabilities, but also how she positioned herself within the social ecosystem of Riverside High. The girl who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility was discovering that sometimes the most effective strategy was to step fully into the light, to claim space and demand respect, rather than hoping that silence would provide protection. Standing in the parking lot as students streamed past her toward buses and cars, Sophia realized that she was no longer the same person who had crept through those hallways just that morning. Something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of her own power and responsibility, something that would continue to guide her choices in the days and weeks to come. The shy girl was still there, still part of who she was and always would be. But she was no longer the only part, no longer the aspect of her personality that controlled all her decisions and responses. Jessica's destruction of the portfolio had inadvertently awakened something that had been dormant for too long, something that would prove far more formidable than anyone, including Sophia herself, had ever imagined. The gymnasium at Riverside High had been transformed into something resembling a medieval arena, with portable bleachers arranged in a wide circle around wrestling mats that gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. The annual wellness fair was supposed to be an educational celebration of physical fitness and mental health awareness, but Jessica Rodriguez had managed to twist it into something far more sinister, a public stage for what she clearly intended to be Sophia's final humiliation. Word had spread through the school's social networks with the viral speed that only teenage drama could achieve. Jessica had been called to the office that morning for her interview with Principal Davis, emerging 30 minutes later with a suspension notice and a fury that radiated from her like heat from a forge. Rather than retreat and accept consequences, she had doubled down on her campaign against Sophia, using her remaining hours at school to orchestrate what she described as a, quote, wellness demonstration that would expose the truth about who really belonged at Riverside High. The setup was brilliant in its cruelty and calculated in its public appeal. Jessica had convinced the Student Wellness Committee that a demonstration of self-defense techniques would be both educational and entertaining, perfectly aligned with the fair's mission of promoting student safety and confidence. She had volunteered to lead the demonstration herself, drawing on her background in mixed martial arts training that she had acquired during her years in California. What she hadn't mentioned to the committee was that she intended to use Sophia as her demonstration partner, setting up a confrontation that would appear voluntary while being anything but. The bleachers were packed with students who had been drawn by the promise of entertainment and the electric tension that comes from knowing something dramatic was about to unfold. Teachers moved through the crowd with the slightly anxious expressions of adults who sensed that they were losing control of a situation but couldn't quite identify what was going wrong. The entire scene felt charged with anticipation and danger, like the moment before lightning strikes. Sophia stood at the edge of the gymnasium, her portfolio case clutched against her chest like a shield, watching Jessica command the center of the mats with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her right to take up space. The past 24 hours had been a whirlwind of administrative meetings, evidence collection, and growing support from teachers and counselors who had finally understood the scope of harassment she had been enduring. But none of that preparation had equipped her for this moment, this public confrontation that Jessica had engineered as her final act of revenge. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jessica announced into the wireless microphone that had been provided for the demonstration, her voice carrying easily through the sound system to reach every corner of the packed gymnasium. "Today, we're going to learn about the importance of standing up for yourself when faced with challenging situations. Sometimes in life, people try to take advantage of those they perceive as weak or vulnerable." The words were delivered with the practiced sincerity of someone who had learned to weaponize public speaking, but Sophia could hear the underlying threat that was meant specifically for her. This wasn't going to be an educational demonstration, it was going to be a public execution, designed to humiliate her so thoroughly that any victory she had achieved through administrative channels would be rendered meaningless. "I need a volunteer from the audience," Jessica continued, her eyes scanning the bleachers with predatory precision before settling on Sophia's location near the gymnasium entrance. "Someone who might benefit from learning how to defend themselves in difficult situations. Sophia Chen, would you please join me on the mats?" The request hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be ignored or deflected. Hundreds of pairs of eyes turned toward Sophia, some curious, others sympathetic, many simply hungry for whatever drama was about to unfold. She could see teachers beginning to move toward the demonstration area, their expressions showing growing concern about the direction this event was taking, but they were too far away to intervene quickly. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Sophia remained frozen at the edge of the gymnasium, her mind cycling through all the possible responses to Jessica's public challenge. She could refuse to participate, claiming illness or obligation elsewhere, but that would be seen as cowardice and would give Jessica exactly the kind of victory she was seeking. She could accept the challenge but approach it defensively, trying to minimize damage and survive whatever humiliation Jessica had planned. Or she could do something that nobody in that gymnasium expected, including herself. The decision came not from her rational mind, but from some deeper place that had been awakened by months of accumulated injustice and the destruction of her artwork. The shy girl who had spent 3 years avoiding confrontation was finally ready to embrace a different kind of truth about herself, something that had been buried under layers of anxiety and self-doubt, but had never actually disappeared. Sophia set down her portfolio case and began walking across the gymnasium floor toward the wrestling mats, her movement generating a ripple of surprised murmurs from the crowd. But there was something different about her posture and pace that caught the attention of observant students and teachers alike. Instead of the hesitant shuffle that usually characterized her movement through public spaces, she walked with purpose and fluid grace that suggested hidden reserves of physical confidence. "Thank you for volunteering, Sophia," Jessica said as her target approached the demonstration area, her voice dripping with false gratitude while her eyes glittered with anticipation. "I think everyone here will benefit from seeing how important it is to be prepared for unexpected challenges." What Jessica didn't know, what nobody at Riverside High knew, was that Sophia's quiet evenings and weekends weren't spent entirely on art and academic work. For the past 4 years, ever since her family had moved to Oregon and she had begun struggling with the social dynamics of her new environment, Sophia had been training at Dragon's Path Martial Arts Academy under the guidance of Sensei Maria Gonzalez, a former Olympic competitor who specialized in teaching self-defense to young women who had experienced various forms of harassment and abuse. The training had initially been her mother's idea, a response to Sophia's increasing anxiety and social withdrawal that seemed to worsen with each passing month. Linda Chen had hoped that martial arts training might help her daughter develop confidence and resilience, but she had never imagined that it would also provide Sophia with skills that might one day prove essential for her physical and emotional survival. Sensei Gonzalez had recognized something in Sophia that others missed, a natural athleticism combined with disciplined focus that made her an exceptional student of martial arts. While Sophia struggled with verbal communication and social interaction, she excelled at the physical vocabulary of combat, mastering complex techniques with an ease that surprised even experienced instructors. But perhaps more importantly, the training had given her a deep understanding of how to control fear and channel adrenaline into purposeful action. "Now, Sophia," Jessica continued, beginning to circle around her like a predator assessing prey, "let's imagine that someone has been bothering you at school. Maybe they've been messing with your locker, or damaging your property, or just generally making your life difficult. What would you do in a situation like that?" The question was loaded with implications and designed to put Sophia in an impossible position. Any response she gave could be twisted to make her appear either weak and helpless or aggressive and unreasonable. But standing on those mats with hundreds of students watching, Sophia felt something click into place that transformed her understanding of the entire situation. "I would start by trying to resolve the situation through appropriate channels," Sophia replied, her voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium despite the lack of a microphone. "I would document the harassment, report it to school administration, and seek support from trusted adults who could help address the problem systematically." The response was perfectly reasonable and mature, exactly the kind of answer that guidance counselors and anti-bullying programs recommended. But Jessica's expression showed frustrated surprise at Sophia's composed demeanor and articulate response. This wasn't the terrified, stammering victim that Jessica had expected to humiliate in front of the entire school. But what if those channels didn't work? Jessica pressed, moving closer to Sophia and beginning to adopt the aggressive postures that she had learned in her own martial arts training. What if the person causing problems was too clever or too popular for the normal rules to apply to them? The question revealed more about Jessica's mindset than she probably intended, suggesting that she saw herself as above the consequences that applied to ordinary students. But it also created an opening that Sophia recognized from countless training sessions with Sensei Gonzalez, who had taught her that the most dangerous opponents were often those who underestimated their targets. "Then I would have to depend on other resources," Sophia said quietly, her voice carrying a quality that made several students in the front rows lean forward to hear better. "Resources that might surprise people who think they know what I'm capable of." Something in her tone caused Jessica to pause for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features as she processed the unexpected confidence in Sophia's demeanor. But her commitment to this public humiliation was too strong to be deterred by vague warnings, and she resumed her aggressive circling with renewed determination. "Well then, let's see what you've got," Jessica said, suddenly lunging forward with a grab that was designed to look like a demonstration technique but carried enough force and malicious intent to cause real harm. What happened next unfolded with a speed and precision that left the entire gymnasium in stunned silence. Instead of being grabbed and thrown as Jessica had intended, Sophia moved with fluid grace that seemed to defy physics, redirecting Jessica's momentum while maintaining perfect balance and control. Jessica found herself flying through the air in a perfect arc before landing hard on the wrestling mat, the impact driving the breath from her lungs and leaving her gasping in shock and humiliation. The technique was a classic Aikido throw that Sophia had practiced thousands of times under Sensei Gonzalez's guidance, but executed with a perfection that suggested not just technical mastery, but an intuitive understanding of timing and leverage that couldn't be taught. The movement had been so smooth and effortless that many observers weren't sure what they had just witnessed, only that Jessica was now lying on the mat while Sophia remained standing in a relaxed but ready posture. "That's called using an attacker's aggression against them," Sophia said calmly, her voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent gymnasium. "Sometimes the person who appears to be in control is actually creating their own vulnerability." Jessica scrambled to her feet, her face flushed with embarrassment and rage at having been so thoroughly outmaneuvered in front of the entire school. The public humiliation that she had planned for Sophia had been turned back on her with devastating effectiveness, transforming her from predator to victim in the span of a few seconds. "Lucky shot," Jessica snarled, abandoning any pretense of educational demonstration as she prepared to attack again, this time with obvious malicious intent that even the most oblivious observers could recognize. But her second attempt fared no better than the first. Sophia seemed to anticipate Jessica's movement before it began, stepping aside with minimal effort while extending one foot to trip her opponent. Jessica went down hard again, this time landing in a sprawling heap that looked thoroughly undignified and suggested that her martial arts training was more superficial than she had claimed. "Another important principle," Sophia observed, her voice maintaining the same educational tone that Jessica had used earlier, "is that aggression without wisdom usually defeats itself." The crowd was beginning to react now, with students throughout the bleachers murmuring in amazement, and teachers moving more urgently toward the demonstration area. Principal Davis appeared at the edge of the mats, his expression showing a mixture of concern and fascination as he processed what was happening in his gymnasium. Jessica made 2 more attempts to physically dominate Sophia, each one resulting in her being thrown or tripped with techniques that appeared effortless but demonstrated a level of martial arts skill that none of the observers had suspected existed at Riverside High. By the 4th failed attack, even Jessica's most devoted followers were beginning to look embarrassed by their leader's performance. "I think that's enough demonstration for today," Principal Davis announced, stepping onto the mats with the authority that comes from years of breaking up student conflicts. But his intervention was almost unnecessary. Jessica was now sitting on the mat looking dazed and defeated, while Sophia remained standing in the center of the demonstration area looking perfectly composed and unruffled. The gymnasium erupted in applause, but it wasn't the kind of polite recognition that typically followed student presentations. This was genuine amazement and appreciation for a performance that had exceeded everyone's expectations, while delivering justice in a way that felt both satisfying and appropriate. Students who had never spoken to Sophia before were now looking at her with respect and admiration, while Jessica's former supporters were beginning to distance themselves from someone whose carefully constructed image had just been thoroughly demolished. "Ms. Rodriguez, please report to my office immediately," Principal Davis said, his tone leaving no room for argument or delay. "Ms. Chen, I'd like to speak with you as well, but first I think you deserve the recognition you've earned here today." As Jessica limped off the mats and out of the gymnasium, followed by the whispered comments and barely suppressed laughter of students who had witnessed her public downfall, Sophia found herself surrounded by classmates who wanted to congratulate her and ask questions about her unexpected martial arts abilities. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. The invisible girl had suddenly become the most interesting person at Riverside High. "That was incredible," said Maya Patel, a junior who had been one of the few students to consistently treat Sophia with kindness over the years. "Where did you learn to do that? I had no idea you knew martial arts." "I've been training for a few years," Sophia replied, still processing the enormity of what had just happened and how completely it had changed her status within the school's social ecosystem. "I just never had a reason to demonstrate it before." David Kim from her chemistry class pushed through the crowd with an expression of pure admiration. "You're like a secret superhero," he said, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by excited enthusiasm. "Jessica's been terrorizing people for months, and you just handled it like it was nothing." The attention was overwhelming but not unpleasant, representing a complete reversal of the isolation and invisibility that had characterized Sophia's high school experience. Students who had never acknowledged her existence were now treating her like a celebrity, while teachers looked at her with new respect for someone who had resolved a serious bullying situation through skill and restraint, rather than aggression or retaliation. Mrs. Martinez pushed through the crowd with tears in her eyes, clearly moved by seeing her student emerge from months of harassment with such dignity and strength. "I'm so proud of you," she said, embracing Sophia with the warmth of someone who had watched her struggle and grow over the years. "You handled that situation with more maturity and grace than most adults would have managed." As the crowd began to disperse and normal gymnasium activities resumed, Sophia made her way toward Principal Davis's office for what she assumed would be another administrative meeting about the Jessica situation. But the conversation that followed was unlike anything she had experienced before, focusing not on discipline or consequences, but on opportunities and possibilities that her unexpected demonstration had created. "Miss Chen," Principal Davis began, his tone conveying genuine admiration along with his professional authority, "what you did in that gymnasium was remarkable, not just from a technical standpoint, but in terms of how you handled an extremely difficult situation. You showed restraint, skill, and wisdom that would be impressive in someone twice your age." The praise felt surreal after years of being overlooked and underestimated, but Sophia was beginning to understand that her careful cultivation of invisibility had hidden strengths that even she hadn't fully recognized. The martial arts training that had been intended to build confidence had also prepared her for moments like this one, when passive resistance was insufficient and direct action became necessary. "I want you to know that Jessica Rodriguez has been suspended for the remainder of the school year," Principal Davis continued, "and there will be additional consequences related to the harassment campaign you documented so thoroughly. But more importantly, I hope today's events have shown you how much support you have within our school community." The meeting concluded with discussions about college recommendations, scholarship opportunities, and leadership positions that might allow Sophia to use her newfound visibility for positive purposes. The shy girl who had entered Riverside High 3 years earlier was evolving into someone who understood her own capacity for both strength and wisdom, someone who could protect herself and others without losing the compassion and integrity that defined her character. Walking through the hallways after school that day, Sophia noticed how completely her experience had transformed. Students who had never acknowledged her existence now greeted her with smiles and respect. Teachers looked at her with new appreciation for someone who had solved a serious problem through skill and restraint. Even the physical space of the school felt different, no longer a hostile environment to be navigated carefully, but a community where she belonged and could contribute meaningfully. Her phone buzzed with messages from Sensei Gonzalez, who had somehow already heard about the gymnasium demonstration and wanted to express her pride in a student who had applied her training with such wisdom and effectiveness. There were also messages from her mother, who was simultaneously amazed and concerned about the dramatic change in her daughter's status at school. As Sophia reached her locker for the first time in weeks without anxiety or fear, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning, when she had discovered her destroyed artwork. The girl who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility had discovered that true strength sometimes required stepping fully into the light, claiming space and demanding respect rather than hoping that silence would provide protection. The portfolio case that had once contained her destroyed artwork now held new pieces that she had created in response to recent events, drawings and paintings that explored themes of resilience, transformation, and the hidden strength that exists within people who appear vulnerable. The art was different now, bolder and more confident, reflecting an artist who had learned to see herself as someone worth defending. Jessica's campaign of harassment had been intended to diminish and destroy, but it had inadvertently awakened something that would prove far more powerful than anyone had imagined. The shy girl with the hidden strength had emerged from her protective shell and discovered that she was capable of changing not just her own circumstances, but the entire culture of her school. As she gathered her books and prepared to leave Riverside High that afternoon, Sophia understood that this was just the beginning of a much larger transformation. The confidence and skills she had discovered would serve her well in college and beyond, but more importantly, she had learned that strength used wisely could create positive change that extended far beyond personal victory. The girl who had once hidden in empty classrooms and bathroom stalls was walking out of school as someone who understood her own power and responsibility, someone who would use her voice and her strength to create the kind of world where bullying became impossible, because potential victims refused to remain silent and communities refused to tolerate injustice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.